today we're going to study form, rhythm and meter, and rhyme for poetry. And we're going to apply those skills primarily to a sonnet, so it will be helpful if you have your book out and open either to the glossary or to the album on sonnet, but also to familiarize yourself with those definitions would be rather helpful. I'm going to incorporate them into this presentation. One of the most difficult concepts that students get to know with poetry is this idea of rhythm and meter. And so I'm going to dive right into it so that I can help you understand and make it a little less overwhelming. Your book does a really nice job of describing feet and meter and that sort of thing, but I think I can break it down for you a little more effectively. First, you have to understand the concept of the syllable, and that's going to help you figure out the foot and the rhythm to the piece. What is a syllable? Well, a syllable, every word that we utter has a syllable, and that one word has one syllable to it. Syllable, syllable. How many different breaks in the word do you hear? Syllable, 3. Okay, so first, understanding how words break apart will help you understand that concept. And I'll show you how to do that. And one of the recommendations that I definitely have is to get a dictionary out. If you cannot hear the word breaks, then why would you disable yourself? That way, get a dictionary and look at how the dictionary breaks out syllables, and you'll start seeing that in what you're studying in the future. And having a dictionary on hand to see where the breaks are is very important. What we need to know about the syllable in regard to poetry is the concept of a stressed or an unstressed syllable. And on your screen here, you can see that I have the syllable in the upper left-hand corner, and we have a stressed, which we're going to represent with a slash. And when we say a syllable that is more stressed, it's going to be a louder, more forceful sound. And when we use an unstressed syllable, it's going to be a softer part of the word. So, syllable. Where do you hear the stress for that word? Syllable. I hear it at the very beginning. So our stress mark would actually go over the syll part of the word rather than the able. That would be more unstressed portions of the word. So we'd have a slash and an unstressed mark with that. We're going to tie this into some lines of poetry here in a second. So just keep that in mind. Stressed syllable or an unstressed syllable. Now, if you look to the second part, the foot part of the screen, you'll see that we have 4 primary feet. And by the way, there are tons more feet, but I'm just giving you the ones that are most likely going to be used in literature, or that you're most likely to face in the poems and works that we're studying. What is a foot? A foot would be a series of stressed and unstressed syllables that go together in order to follow a pattern. So it's kind of like a rhythm in a musical composition. Where do you hit certain notes? Where do where do certain beats happen? Those notes that you have that tell you whether it's a quarter note or a whole note, or how many beats in order to keep holding that particular note. That's what we're talking about here with feet. Okay, so here in our foot section, you'll notice that I have 4 different types of poetic feet, if you will. First is the iamb, and you'll notice that it is colored in red. Why? Because it's the most commonly used. In most of what we're going to be studying, it's going to be a pretty good guess that we have an iambic rhythm. And that was, it happens to be the most used in daily speech. It's the most natural for English. And so it tends to be very well used, and especially during the Renaissance time period. And if you're going back to classical literature, which we are, we have a lot of classical pieces here, the English used the iamb because it was the most natural with the speech. You don't want your poetry to sound too contrived. So, a lot of the poets would play around with natural speech patterns, and iambic patterns tended to be one of the ones that was used quite regularly. But when you want to emphasize other words, or put a different rhythm, something that's just a little off, something that's just a little bit different, then we have these other ones. The first one is a trochee, instead of, and when you would use that in its adjective form. It would be trochaic. And so you have a stressed syllable followed by a light syllable, or stressed followed by an unstressed syllable. Trochee is how you say that, and that's how the emphasis would be too. Whereas with an I am, you would do I am. I am is how that stressing would sound if you're applying it to a word. We also have anapest and dactyl, or anapestic and dactylic feet, and those use 3 syllables to create its poetic foot. So you have with an anapest, you have an unstressed, unstressed, stressed, so 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. And a pest is how that word would sound if you're stressing the syllables. And a pest. And then if you have dactyl, and I'm going to have to do the adjectival form on this one in order to get you to hear that. Dactylic. If we had the word dactylic. Dactylic is how that would sound or be represented with the syllable stresses. A stressed syllable followed by 2 light syllables. Dactylic. So we've broken those words apart, and we're listening to how they sound based on their syllables that are offered here. That can kind of give you a little bit of a sense of, well, how do I do this? How do I break this out? If you look over to the right-hand side of the page, you'll see that we also are studying a concept of meter. And most of the time, you're going to have works that are going to be expressed in trimeter or trimeter. That would be 3 feet, so whether it is in an iambic or an anapestic foot, if we have 3 of those feet, we have a trimeter or a trimeter. We also have tetrameter, which would be 4 feet, and pentameter, 5 feet. The most commonly used ones would be these 3, with tetrameter and pentameter being some of the most used certainly in classical poetry anyway. But you can see that, the very beginning, what's the concept of 1 represented by? Mono. Okay, mono would be 1, and so we have 1 foot. Dimeter or di, that concept of 2, would be what's on here. And it just interprets the number associated with the meter. So don't try to make this too hard. The last part of the word is always going to be meter, and it's just how many meters or how many feet do you have in order to create that meter. All right, so now that I've utterly confused you, let's go on in. I hope I haven't. I hope that this is going to gel once we get into the next slide, and we're going to go on ahead and apply this to a poem. What we're going to first do is break apart a few words, and like I said before, if you don't understand how to break words into syllables, then you need to get out a dictionary and you need to see how they do actually break. So I have put towards the top here, I bulleted a few of the words that are going to come from this Shakespearean piece, and they're the words that would have more than 1 syllable. So if you look down to the lines, shall, how many syllables does shall have? Shall. It's 1. So I'm not going to break apart that word. It only has 1 syllable. Same thing for I. I. It only has 1 syllable. So you don't break apart the words that have only 1 syllable. You only break apart the words that have multiple syllables in order to kind of look and see, okay, so here's where they break. Now, where is the stress? And your dictionary will tell you that too, either with a bolding or using symbols similar to what I'm using. So here, if I've broken down the words that have multiple syllables, so we have compare. Compare. Where do the stresses occur? Compare. Well, it sounds to me like pair is a little more emphasizing. The idea of come is kind of a softer sound anyway. So if I were to put some stresses on there, compare, we would have pair having the slash mark on there. And let me just add those in here. Summer, summer. Do you go summer or do you go summer? You can hear that stress at the very beginning of the word. So that helps you go, oh, okay, I can kind of hear where those stresses are going to naturally occur with the word anyway. And then just put your stress marks above them. Lovely. Lee almost disappears from that word. Lovely. Lovely. Say it naturally. Lovely. The emphasis is on the beginning of that word. And here we have another word, temperate. It has 3 syllables in it. So temperate. Temperate. I'd almost put an unstressed at the end of the ATE, at the end of temperate. But once you actually start putting the stresses into the lines of poetry themselves, you'll see why I put a stress at the very end of that word, because it follows a specific foot or meter. So now if we apply these skills to the actual lines of poetry that we have here, what I usually do is ask students to go ahead and put those stress marks onto the lines in order to see them. And I'm going to give you a guideline that you can try out, but it won't always work, and specifically it's not going to work on this poem. But what words would you naturally go on ahead and emphasize? Usually you would not emphasize a preposition like with or of, or you often would not offer a stress or an emphasizing or an emphasis on the word and. But sometimes in order to make the meter work, you do need to. So it's a matter of just figuring out the feel to the lines and how they're supposed to be said or how they're supposed to be broken down. And so I'm going to just read the line out loud and listen for where the major stresses are. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Well, I definitely hear one on day. That word just kind of pops out as, you've got to hold on to it a little bit longer. So probably going to have the stresses there. I'm going to look up, I've got summers already. Summer day. And so the very end of the line is going to be a stress syllable. And the rest of them is kind of like, okay, so compare, I can get that. Unstressed followed by a stressed. I figured that out just looking at the word itself. So if we put those marks in there, we can also kind of see, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Normally I go, honestly, you're going to emphasize that word when you say it. I wouldn't normally. It doesn't seem natural necessarily. But not everything's going to work out perfectly the way that we think it should be. It's a matter of getting those rhythm marks in there and thinking, okay, this is how I think it's going to be. And if I try out other things, try out an anapest or try out a dactylic meter, then you just roll those around for a little bit. But overall, just what is natural, what fits most naturally with it. And what I saw with compare and to summer's day, with some of those marks, it naturally started being an iambic meter. So if we read it through one more time, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That is just kind of naturally reading it, or shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You can hear some of the emphasis that's supposed to be on those words, and you can kind of figure out that you have this where a majority of those emphasis would be. Let's look at the next line. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Well, I probably would not emphasize that and normally, but for the meter, if we have the lee and lovely going as an unstressed syllable, then the next syllable has to be stressed. And when you think about it, it does make a little bit more sense to go ahead and emphasize it. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. To emphasize not only are you this, but you are also this, could make sense logically. But let's just throw down the ideas of temperate. Would we emphasize more, or would we emphasize, or would we unstress it? Well, it depends on the words around it. in my opinion. So if we're thinking about, okay, what's the most commonly used structure and what did we do with the line above it, if we're applying an iambic meter, we have thou art, and more would be unstressed, more lovely, and more temperate. We have 5 feet of iambic meter, which would be called iambic pentameter. How do we see the feet? How do we even get to the whole idea of understanding that there are 5 feet? Do you see how I've boxed in the unstressed followed by the stressed mark there on the screen? So foot number 1 is shall I, compare would be number 2, the 2 would be foot number 3, a sun, and you might be thinking, can you split a foot in the middle of a word, Summers? Yes, absolutely. The word doesn't hold the foot together, the syllables hold the foot together, so that's why we're splitting it or breaking it there. Stay would be the 5th one, so that's how we have 5 iambic feet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that line, and we also have 5 in the next line. So overall, this piece contains 5 iambic feet, which means that it's iambic pentameter. So we're going to move on to this idea of rhyme and form to help define the work itself as well. And first you need to know a few terms to be able to apply them. First, what is a couplet? A couplet would be 2 successive rhyming lines, and so the line and then the line below it both rhyme. That would be a couplet. Or what's a couple? 2 people or 2 things. A couple of shoes or a pair of shoes, same concept. So a couple makes a couplet, a couple of lines that happen to rhyme that are right above and below each other. That would be a couplet. So what makes it heroic? The idea of whether it's an iambic meter or not. And let me flip back to the previous slide. Are these lines that we're looking at, do they rhyme? So would they be a couplet? Look at the end of the line, day, temperate. Well, of course, they don't rhyme. There's no rhyme to them, so they can't possibly be a couplet. They are an iambic pentameter, but if they don't rhyme, they can't possibly be a couplet. So what we have here is either no rhyme or alternating lines of rhyme. We'd have to look at the next 2 lines to see, do they rhyme with these, in order to decide, okay, what kind of rhyme do we have here? All right, so a couplet, those lines have to be right above and below each other. And if you see that a couple of lines that are right above and below each other happen to have the same meter, rhythm and meter, and that rhythm and meter is iambic pentameter, then you have what's called a heroic couplet. It's given a little bit more honor than just a traditional couplet. And the next concept that we're getting into is this idea of how do you study a sonnet, or what is a sonnet composed of. And a sonnet, the basic definition would be that it's a poem that happens to be 14 lines, and usually it's offered in iambic pentameter, but as we move into the 20th century, you're going to see that rule break a little bit. More modern poets did not always follow that particular design. Some of them used iambic tetrameter, so 4 feet, but not 5. And does that make it any less of a sonnet? No. If it's 14 lines and it has a definite meter and rhyme to it, then it's probably a sonnet. We're going to look at 2 primary sonnets, and again, there are lots of different types of sonnets. In a couple of my dictionaries in my office, or handbooks, literary term handbooks, they have, upwards of 6 or 8 different types of sonnets that have been formed. We're going to only focus on these 2 for right now. That's most of what we'll study in Intro to Literature. If you get into some of the other specialty courses like African American literature or women writers, you might see that there are new sonnets to be defined. For right now, we're going to keep it simple. So we have 14 lines, and in the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, you have those 14 lines divided into an octave, or 8 lines, 8. And typically they interlink with the way that they rhyme. And the most common one is with a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, B, A would be those 8 lines. And you'll see how that works here in the next slide. So you have 8 lines that are together that have a similar rhyme scheme. And then the last 6 lines work together, and they rhyme in some manner. The other type that we're going to study for this class will be an English or Shakespearean sonnet, which is typically divided into 3 quatrains, or quatrain. What is a quatrain? That would be 4 rhyming lines of poetry. 4 rhyming lines, so paired together, or all 4 of those lines are together in one stanza, or all 14 lines might be in the same stanza, but you can clearly see a demarcation between those 4 lines. Something changes when those 4 lines as you go through the piece. And one of the components that's important about understanding which type of a sonnet that you have and seeing those breaks, or seeing, do I have an octave and a sestet, is this concept of a call and a response, or a question and an answer. Or so often in the first 8 lines there is a question or a concept posed that the last 6 lines of the work answers, if you have an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. Shakespeare, an English or Shakespearean sonnet, typically has the concept divided into 4 different sections, and typically the couplet at the very end has the answer. So it's developed in the first 3 quatrains, or first 3 stanzas, or first 3 parts, and then the couplet provides the final answer to it. So that concept of transitions in poems, it happens here. Sonnets are a natural form that would offer a concept of transitioning in poetry. So you want to look for that too. Where's the idea presented, and where is it either answered or finished or complete? If it's in multiple lines, like 6 lines or so, then you probably have an Italian sonnet. Or if it's answered primarily in that last couplet, then you probably have an English or Shakespearean sonnet. So let's apply these skills. We're going to look at William Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And if I were really clever, I would have left his name off, because, gee, can you guess what kind of sonnet this is? But we're going to go through the pattern just so that you can actually see it. So first, what we want to do is we want to label the rhyme scheme. And you label each line with a letter, beginning with the letter A. So obviously, first line, it's an A. The very end word is day. To get what the next letter is, we have to look at line 2. How does it end? Does it end with the rhyming line that rhymes with day? Well, temperate and day do not rhyme, so we have to offer a different letter. It cannot be an A, it must be a B. Let's look at the third line. May, does it rhyme with either temperate or day? Well, yes, it rhymes with day. So we're going to give that one an A, so that we're showing day and May rhyme. They work together, they form a rhyme. Let's look at line 4. Date, temperate. Well, that's what's called a broken rhyme. It looks the same and it sounds the same if you break the word a little bit. More temperate, date. Those, we have some broken rhyme here. Our next word, shines. Does it rhyme with any of the words that have come before it? Day, May, nope, it's not an A. Temperate or date, nope, doesn't rhyme with that. So we give it a new letter, a C. What about dimmed? Does dimmed rhyme with shines? Nope. Date? Nope. May? Nope. Dimmed is a new line, That does not rhyme with any of the previous, so we give it a new letter, a D. Declines. Well, that rhymes with shines. So again, we're going to recognize that those rhyme by giving them the same letter, a C. So what does untrimmed rhyme with? Dimmed. So we're giving it a D. And we can finish that throughout the rest of the piece. The next line, fade. Does it rhyme with anything else? Nope. It's an E. Thou owest. Nope. Doesn't rhyme with anything yet. How about shade? That rhymes with fade. And so we're giving it an E. And growest and owest. And then the last lines, nope, they don't rhyme with anything else in here. So that's a new letter, a G. But then those last lines would also be a G. C and thee, they rhyme together. So what do we call this? When you have an AB structure, you have every other line rhyming, or in other words, alternating lines rhyming. You know, when you alternate, you go every other one. Alternate here, we have alternating rhyming lines, but that's not the case throughout the whole piece, right? At the very end, we have what? What would we have if we have two succeeding lines that rhyme? If we have two, then it must be a couple or a couplet, right? So when we go to describe this piece now, we have these alternating lines of rhyme, and then at the very end we have this couplet, and so that's how we would define this particular form. Throughout it alternates its rhyme. Every other line rhymes. It happens to be in a quatrain, even though this poem was not divided into separate stanzas. We can see the quatrains that exist because we have AB, AB. Those all go together. And then we have a new rhyme scheme brought in, CD, CD. So that's how you can see the quatrains, or the 4 lines. Quatrains would be for the 4 lines. And then at the very bottom you have a neat little couplet. This one happens to be heroic because, as we defined in the other slides, the meter and the rhythm and the meter are iambic pentameter. So we don't just have any old couplet. We have a heroic couplet since it is in iambic pentameter. Now it's your turn to practice. And I know we've tackled it with the sonnet. The best advice that I can give to you when you're studying poetry and you're thinking about, you know, what type of a form is this poem taking on, you're probably going to have either a ballad or a sonnet or a narrative poem. Sometimes we have these ideas of a sestina. So if you were to look up and define those particular types of poems and then start applying the rhyme scheme and the rhythm and the meter to that piece, you would be able to kind of test the limits and see, okay, here's how I can see how all these pieces fit together to make this a ballad, or to make this a sestina, or to make this a sonnet. You can take the definition and help you figure out what that piece is. So that's how you're able to define it. All these pieces work together. And the big question that I have is, why? Why on earth would people decide to write a formula in order to create a particular type of poem? Doesn't that get kind of boring? Doesn't that get kind of repetitive? Isn't it copying? The truth is, yes. All of those answers are very true. But if you try to sit down and write a poem that is serious, and you are trying to get this rhythm and meter to work out without sounding contrived, without sounding like you really had to work hard at getting all of these things to work out, to make the poem make sense, it's not an easy task. It shows off part of the artistry that goes into writing poems. You know, writing a poem from an idea without any form is difficult enough, just to make the ideas just make sense. But to add a layer onto it of, okay, this idea deserves a little more honor. So am I going to choose a ballad, or am I going to choose to write it in the form of a sonnet? Thinking through those kinds of things and what's appropriate to my message. Well, it lies in the definition of what you're actually writing. And it also goes to the idea of what type of a poem you're actually presenting. Because shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The sonnet form makes sense. Could you take that concept and turn it into a ballad? Well, no, that wouldn't make any sense, because there's no story to shall I compare thee to a summer's day. These are ideas that are being paired, and that's why the couplet's so appropriate. That's why the alternating lines and the quatrains make sense for it. If you were to try to work that into a ballad, it probably will sound very contrived. So it's thinking about the poetry and the form that you want to communicate your message into. That's part of the deal, and why it makes it so important to understand the inner workings of a poem and to see and understand its structure. So this is not just simple exercises that we English teachers just want to make sure that our students are tortured by. These concepts help you see how poetry is more than just a bunch of words splattered onto a page. Yes, sometimes poetry is just that. There's nothing wrong with that. But so often, people want to either give more honor or less honor, or change the structure of what the idea is in order to communicate the idea in a different way. And that's what makes poetry so intriguing, is the artistry, not just the mimicry and the imitation and, oh, I can write a sonnet, I can get this form down. You can get the form down and the message doesn't make any sense, or it's stupid, or it's hokey, or it's so overdone nobody wants to read it. It takes a true working and a true artist to be able to pair the two so that it feels seamless and so that it doesn't feel overdone. And that's how we get our true poets. It's understanding the type of form, and is it appropriate to their message, or does their message even need form or rhythm or meter? Because quite frankly, not all the poems that we're going to read are going to have a definite meter or a rhythm and rhyme to that piece, because it may not be appropriate whatsoever. So understanding these concepts helps you understand what true artistry goes behind poetry and what becomes great literature, but it also helps you understand the purpose behind the poem.